On his 38th birthday, no one showed up. Rodrigo sat at the head of a long table meant for 20 and watched the candles on a cake he hadn't expected to eat alone. The private dining room smelled faintly of oak and citrus, Barolo in an ice bucket, the soft polish of cutlery, a single white rose in a low glass vase. The staff moved around him with the respectful choreography of people accustomed to smoothing things that had frayed. They cleared an extra plate and set a place across from him anyway, as if dignity might repopulate the room. He checked his phone again because checking felt better than not checking. 10 blue bubbles in a group thread. 2 RSVPs marked maybe. A calendar event set to celebration, with the faces of colleagues and acquaintances who had once laughed at the same jokes in the studio. He scrolled until his thumb tired and then put the phone face down on the linen. The screen reflected the ceiling lights like a small, indifferent sky. The wine breathed in its bucket at the center of the table, a bottle of Barolo with a label he could pronounce only because the assistant had recommended it for the price tag. He thought once that fine wine would make every moment taste better. It didn't matter tonight. The Barolo merely tasted of tannins and regret. On the surface, he had everything people map to success. A sleek apartment on the river, models spread across a drafting table that no one open to future projects could ignore, the names of developers on his phone like a litany of hard-won proof. He had built towers that cut into the fog and glass houses that made the city look new. He had awards lodged in tasteful frames. He had clients who called at midnight and expected miracle timelines. He had learned to answer, always, because answering was how deals were kept and reputations sustained. He had not learned how to show up for the people who mattered. That lesson, if it could be called that, arrived in a hollow, banquet-sized silence. There were reasons. He could recite them. The urgent pitch 2 months ago, a client who threatened to walk, a partner who fell ill and needed him to step in. Each a plausible explanation, each a little stone in the glass wall he'd climbed. But they sounded thin in the private room. They sounded like the voices of a building contractor explaining cost overruns, not like excuses that could take the ache out of a birthday candle. No one had called to say they would be late. No one had texted with a photo of a baby or a party favor or traffic. The only message had been from his mother, a small, warm string of words. Happy birthday, hope you rest. Love. He read it and put it aside because messages from his parents were soft landings in evenings, otherwise made of hard angles. He let the waiter pour a small glass of wine. The first sip burned pleasantly through his mouth and then left him with a curious emptiness that had nothing to do with the Barolo. Around him, the room was immaculate. Place cards in elegant script, floral arrangements that leaned toward each other as if conspiring to make the empty seats feel less lonely. They didn't. He thought of all the boxes he had checked, the awards, Contemporary Architecture Prize, the glossy magazine spreads, the project in the heights of the riverfront that would change the skyline by morning. He thought of clients who sounded in voice memos like relatives, familiar, testing, always needing. He had been planned. He had been disciplined. He had been, in all the ways that mattered to his profession, almost perfect. Personal life, he had told himself, was something to be scheduled between deadlines. There would be time later, there would be a weekend, then a longer break. Then he could postpone intimacy the way he postponed sleep. There would always be another chair to pull up. Tonight, the chairs were empty. When the first course arrived, lamb, slow-cooked, rosemary like a memory, he realized he wasn't hungry. He watched the maitre d' move with quiet efficiency, and felt, in the way someone feels the daylight change, a small humiliation creep behind his ribs. He had built walls of glass so people could admire his work, and yet, when he looked up into the space designed to invite others in, the light bounced back only from polished surfaces. He imagined the faces that would have looked up at him, and none of them appeared. He could see his colleagues smiling, but filtered through a different life. He saw an ex-girlfriend's profile in a photograph he'd deleted and could not bring back. He saw the shadow of an empty chair where someone might have been, someone who would have known how to riff a joke into the moment or reach across to check his hand. That phantom was the worst part, that he could name it and not call it. He finished his wine and ordered another. The second glass was quieter, clearer. He let himself think of the skyline he had altered. Each building was a sentence in his career. Together, they formed a book that people read and quoted. He had loved the work with an intensity that made other feelings seem like frivolous flourishes. It had been easy to mistake reputation for intimacy. But tonight, the distinction sharpened into pain. When the staff cleared the desserts away and he was halfway through another thought about how to explain absence to himself, the door to the dining room opened and a woman walked in, holding the hand of a small boy. They looked like they had been traveling with the wind the whole evening. Hair a little mussed, a stroller folded at the woman's hip, a canvas tote swinging from an elbow like a small flag. The woman had a tired smile that somehow did not weaken her. The boy's shoes squeaked lightly on the polished floor. He carried a plastic dinosaur tucked under his arm as if it might slide off. They paused, then smiled apologetically toward the maître d'. The woman spoke first. There was a tone that said they had been pointed toward the café, then redirected, then told no, until the boy's patience thinned, and they had been led to the doorway simply to sit and wait for something else to happen. Parquet, she said, more to herself than to the host, as if offering a destination would make their trespass lighter. The maître d' looked at the place cards and at Rodrigo and took a small, professional breath. He explained that the room was reserved, that a private event was taking place. The woman looked toward the table, and something tightened in her expression, but then it unclenched. She met Rodrigo with a polite, practical gaze that could measure a situation in seconds. Rodrigo, who had been rehearsing an exit he could not bring himself to perform, found his mouth moving before he remembered the etiquette of private rooms. "It's my table," he said. The words arrived with less bravado and more surprise at his own willingness. He stood and stepped aside. "Please, sit, help yourselves, there's food." Her surprised relief was immediate and clean. She thanked him without making a speech. Her name was Beatrice, she said, in the quick, efficient way of people who had to make introductions to get on with other urgencies. The boy tugged at her sleeve and said something about macaroni. Rodrigo's shoulders, which had coiled with the evening's loneliness, eased in a way he did not expect. They sat. The boy climbed onto a chair with a practiced agility and looked about the room like a small inspector of lost events. The child asked for macaroni again, louder this time, and Beatrice laughed, a sound that did not seek to charm, but that warmed the space. The staff, professional and a little relieved, returned with a small plate of buttered elbow macaroni. The boy's face, round and earnest, lit up the way a light bulb does when you finally remember where you left the switch. Rodrigo watched them eat and felt a tug he could not immediately name. The sight of the boy, small hands smearing sauce on the napkin and then wiping with comic solemnity, made the table look less like a staged theatre and more like a home. The rosé of the napery settled somehow in his chest. He had never been around small children in a context that was not also performance, open houses for clients, charity events with polite applause, but this was different. This was not an event. This was simple, messy, real. They asked his name and he told them. He asked about Lucas, short, decisive, and the boy said his name loudly and then insisted that Rodrigo taste his macaroni. Rodrigo allowed his fork to steal a piece and ate it like someone sampling a small, honest truth. It tasted of butter and something homeborn, and he found himself smiling in a way that felt suddenly like a small betrayal of the night he'd planned. Conversation unfolded carefully at first, as conversations do when people have not yet sure-footed their way into each other's lives. Beatrice told him she was a designer, freelance work that shifted from client to client like tides. She spoke about deadlines with the same tone Rodrigo used for architectural problems, somewhere between a battle plan and a negotiation. She spoke of Lucas with the same mixture of fierce protection and practical lighter-than-air humor that single parents learn. The ability to carry profound responsibility while rationing panic. Rodrigo offered the usual awkward questions, the kind that feel like polite scaffolding. Where do you live? How long have you been freelancing? He answered, and his answers sounded different when they left his mouth because someone was listening without motive. Beatrice listened the way a good client listens, focused, ready to pivot the conversation, but offering an earnest interest. Lucas, between chomps of pasta, asked Rodrigo if architects made playgrounds. He asked it with the candid hope that children can summon into a question. Rodrigo said yes, and the boy considered for a moment what that might mean. Did it mean swings that go higher, slides that were tunnels, a secret fort? Rodrigo smiled and tried to explain, drawing with his finger an imaginary curve in the air the way he sometimes did when describing a roofline to a skeptical developer. Lucas's eyes widened, and for a beat Rodrigo felt an unfamiliar pride that had nothing to do with public accolades. Beatrice spoke of a client who had cancelled that afternoon, a last-minute meeting that vanished and left them stranded with no place to go but the restaurant doors. She didn't ask for pity. She told the story like one more item on a long list. She was careful with words about money, not because she was ashamed, but because such admissions felt like private currency. She had a calm that was economical. No theatrics, only the facts. Rodrigo liked that. He liked her composure and her refusal to coat hard things in melodrama. He talked too, though more sparingly. He told her about a project in the Eastern District and about a mentor who had once told him to build the life you want to live, like it was a practical exercise. He mentioned his mother and his occasional inability to remember birthdays without the preoccupation of the calendar. He did not confess all his compromises. The weight of his missed opportunities remained private. But he admitted, in a way that surprised him, that tonight felt bigger than a calendar oversight. He admitted to wanting company that would not cancel with a forwarded calendar invite. The boy reached for Rodrigo's hand and held it for a second like he'd anchored himself there. A small thing, a child's grip, warm, trusting, the kind that does not yet divide the world into transactions. Rodrigo felt the pressure like a small, instantaneous correct. After dessert, which they shared, a slice of something chocolate and slightly too sweet, Beatrice asked if Rodrigo would mind if they ate on a side table for a while. She explained that Lucas needed a place to run off a little energy before the evening, and that she didn't want to be a burden. Rodrigo laughed, because how could she be a burden when she had made the table feel alive again? He waved her over. The maitre d' cleared the chairs and smiled as if the night had been repaired. There is a particular kind of quiet that follows the jagged edge of humiliation when someone responds to it not with sympathy, but with ordinary kindness. It felt less like a hand being extended to him than the room bending toward him to let the light in. Rodrigo felt something he hadn't expected, relief so sharp it hurt. After they paid, he insisted, but they split the bill in the end, which made him smile at their independence. He offered to drive them home. It was an impulsive courtesy, the sort of offer you make when you are trying to translate grief into action. Beatrice hesitated and then accepted. She told him there was a quiet block not far away, a street with plants on every stoop, a building that had held tenants for years and where a neighbor always left spare shoes on the stoop for visitors in need. It was the kind of detail that makes a city a neighborhood. They walked out together into a humid night. The city air smelled of late summer concretions and someone grilling somewhere in the distance. The walk to Rodrigo's car, the small car he kept, because he liked the way it fit into tight spaces, was a short one, and the boy skipped next to them like a small dog on a leash, stopping to examine a puddle, then running again. Inside the car, Lucas settled against the window with a contented sigh and began to hum a song to himself. He fell quiet after a few minutes and then asked Rodrigo, out of the blue, if he had a sister. The question landed like debris you pick up without meaning to. Rodrigo laughed and said no. He told Lucas that he had a lot of models, though, buildings, not people, and Lucas pretended not to understand the distinction. Beatrice spoke less in the car. She watched Rodrigo drive with an expression that sometimes accompanies strangers who meet each other and decide, by mutual consent, to start without a map. She told him about the street where they lived, about the building with its chipped paint and the neighbor below who left jars of preserves by the door. She described the neighbor's cat, a squat thing with a permanent look of confusion. The details were modest and precise and felt, to Rodrigo, like a map of a world he had not designed and did not yet know the value of. When they reached their block, Lucas shuffled out, yawning, and Beatrice thanked him, as if thanking could do the necessary amount of return for an act that cost him little, a ride that meant more to them because it rescued their evening. She offered him a quick, practical smile and a card with a name on it. Beatrice Santos. Under it, she had scribbled a number, not because she expected an exchange of favors, but because she thought, reasonably, that people should keep each other's numbers when roads cross. He took the card and tucked it into his wallet with an odd tenderness. Standing on his steps later, after he'd walked back to his car, he felt the city press around him with familiar indifference. He drove home with the windows down and the engine low, thinking of how small gestures persist. Back in his apartment, the space felt both larger and emptier. The walls, which until now had reflected his successes, echoed with the memory of a child's laughter. He lay awake that night without knowing how to catalogue the feeling. It was like being given a room and then noticing the dust on the floor. He could have dismissed the evening as an anomaly, a random collision of lives. He could have told himself he would go back to the work that mattered, to the spreadsheets and the midnight calls and the careful curations of public life. Instead, he made a stupid, deliberate choice. He wrote Beatrice a short message, not a long note, not a rehearsal of intentions that would sound false in daylight. He sent a text first, a simple, practical line. "Thank you for sharing the table with me. It made the night better." Then he added, because people are always braver when they can choose the last syllable, "Would you like to meet for coffee this weekend?" It was small. It was the kind of thing he had rarely done. He went to the window after he sent it and watched the river light smear across the dark like a tentative suggestion of a path. Beatrice replied with something that embodied the economy of her life. She said yes, and then asked if he could come by the park at 11 on Saturday. She said she had a meeting set for noon and needed to be close. She signed off with a quick, "Lucas likes the playground by the fountain." He stared at the message and felt a tenderness that startled him. He thought of all the hours he had spent erecting structures that would outlast him. He had never considered that some of the most important work might happen on benches and beneath trees. There was a moment of private indecision. To be present would mean wasting a Saturday he had, until now, reserved for catching up, or for a client who would eventually text at all hours. Being present would mean saying no to an email, to a proposal, to an urgent look on a man's face that would dissolve into polite gratitude if answered. But there was also a pull that felt like gravity, like something making room for a life he had not designed. He cancelled a meeting. It wasn't dramatic. He sent a short note to his assistant. Push the 10 a.m. to next week. Call client and reschedule. He typed it with the same precision he might use when redrawing a line on a plan. He felt the small adrenaline that comes from taking control of time rather than letting time control you. Then he closed his laptop and that evening went to bed not with a plan for the skyline, but with the idea of meeting a woman and a small boy in a park, because, for once, there was something he wanted to arrive for. Saturday arrived with indecisive weather, sun like a promise interrupted by clouds. The park was larger than he remembered from the last time he'd walked through an urban green as a way to escape a client dinner. People were scattered on blankets, dogs ran in polite arcs, and somewhere a saxophone riffed as if trying to give the afternoon a soundtrack. He found the fountain, its slabs warm from the day, and Beatrice sitting on a bench, Lucas at her feet, swinging a small plastic truck. She greeted him like someone who had already decided the easy thing, that strangers can become part of the day without a grand ceremony. Lucas ran up when he saw Rodrigo and said, without ceremony, "We saved a spot." Then he handed Rodrigo a half-melted popsicle. It was the kind of off-hand gift children give that has all the social value of an offering. They spent hours in the way ordinary afternoons go on, watching a duck navigate a pond, comparing the best route to climb down a slide, arguing over whether a tree trunk could be a pirate ship. Rodrigo taught Lucas a clumsy trick with building blocks he'd done once at a charity event ages ago. Lucas listened as if the trick were an epic. Beatrice watched them without needing to narrate feelings. She talked about a client proposal she had to send out by Monday, about the difficulties of time management when your day is punctuated by another person's nap schedule. She said, plainly and with no appeal to pity, that she sometimes had to turn down work because she couldn't be in two places at once. Rodrigo listened and felt the hard, clean edge of responsibility press against him. He thought of the meetings he had chosen to take, of the evenings he had worked past dinner, and felt an unfamiliar shame for the way he had prioritized projects over people. He had always told himself that his work would make a world better for others. Tonight, he realized better in what currency. He had been a builder of cities, but hadn't yet learned to build a life that kept people inside when storms came. At one point, Lucas fell off a bench, scraped a knee, and Rodrigo watched Beatrice's reaction like a new subject at school. She crouched, kissed the scrape, and pulled a Band-Aid from the bottom of her tote. No drama. She soothed, cleaned, and then, with a practical cheerfulness, declared them both brave. Rodrigo held Lucas's hand while Beatrice bandaged him. The boy smiled and said, "We are brave," then insisted Rodrigo eat a crumb of the popsicle he'd been holding as evidence of friendship. The small, shared foolishness of it, Luke wiping a sticky thumb on Rodrigo's sleeve and Rodrigo pretending to be scandalized, was an intimacy born of very little and therefore very true. That evening, as he walked home, Rodrigo realized how much of his life had been constructed on assumptions that time could be bought later, that connection would wait while the towers rose. He also realized how dangerous those assumptions had been. A career could give him public recognition, but recognition does not tuck a child into bed or send a text in the night when someone needs to know they are seen. He had to choose presence, and choosing presence would require him to step off the treadmill of unending tasks. He did not yet know what that looked like in full. He only knew a direction, toward more evenings like the one at the park and fewer evenings stitched together by leftover work. He imagined small things, volunteering to pick Lucas up from school sometimes, learning the school route, watching a recital he would otherwise have missed. He imagined conversation over coffee that was not dominated by client notes and felt, thrillingly, like an alternate blueprint. A week passed, and the rhythms of ordinary life tried to drag him back. An urgent email about facade revisions, a call from a developer who needed floor plans in 48 hours, a designer from the firm asking if he could cameo at a presentation. Each tug pulled like a familiar gravity, testing the sturdiness of any commitment he'd made to himself. But there were other tugs now, too. A message from Beatrice. "Lucas keeps asking when you'll come over again." A photo of Lucas making a tower from empty cereal boxes. Caption, "Architect in the making." The photo felt like a gentle claim laid over his chest. He started to rearrange his day in ways that felt less heroic than practical. He began to take 2 trains instead of a car to work when the traffic stretched his schedule to thinness because he had learned the extra time on the train could be reallocated to a visit. He kept a spare sock in his desk drawer, not because he lived to be a fixer, but because a small parent's request could be accommodated if he had the humility to prepare. On a rainy Thursday, Beatrice texted with a different rhythm. "An urgent client meeting," she said, with the quiet signature of someone juggling plates. Could he watch Lucas tomorrow afternoon while she pitched? She did not make it sound like a favor. She made it sound like something that needed arranging, like asking if someone could water a plant. The writing was practical. Rodrigo read the message twice. He felt the old reflex flare, declined to preserve the promptable safety of solo productivity. He felt the older version of himself, reliable in the way that counts in business, lean and whisper about schedules and deliverables. He also felt a new, steadier voice. This is an invitation to show up. He thought about the private dining room, about the way the child's small hand had anchored his holiday, about how the house he kept could feel more like a shelter if it housed more than trophies. He pictured Lucas's scraped knee and the Band-Aid and felt, ridiculous as it sounded, a resolute warmth. He typed, without theatricality, "Yes, I'll come by." Beatrice's reply was immediate. "Thank you. I owe you one." She added a small emoji, just a smiling face. It was not dramatic. It was an exchange between 2 people now calibrating the practicalities of care. That night, when Rodrigo shut his laptop and imagined the next day, the city hummed with ordinary noises. He knew challenges waited. He knew that every act of showing up carried with it complications and moments he would have to learn to navigate. Schedules that would conflict, clients who would demand immediate attention, nights when he would have to refuse a call. He also knew that this was how life changed, not in declarations, but in choices. Not with grand gestures, but with the accumulation of small, consistent acts. He slept, finally, with a quiet that was not empty for the first time in months. The room might still be large and the night could still be long. But there was now something to orient toward, a small boy's expectation, a mother's quiet trust, and the possibility that his own architecture could be extended to the life he held when he closed his office door. He slept, finally, with a quiet that was not empty. The next morning the city woke in the same indifferent way it always did. Trams, delivery trucks, a man on a balcony swearing at a plant. But something about Rodrigo's apartment felt different. Not because the furniture had rearranged itself, or because an invisible hand had placed warmth on the mantel, but because he had agreed to be somewhere he would have previously scheduled away from. He had, in a small way, chosen the people in his life over the uninterrupted progress of plans. The early days that followed were not cinematic. They were domestic and awkward and honest. There were texts with typos and missed calls. There were times he arrived late, and Beatrice did not pretend it did not matter. There were also moments that, when strung together, began to look like the architecture of a life. He learned Lucas's rhythms. He learned the precise hour when the boy's energy broke and he needed quiet. He learned that Lucas liked his peanut butter without the crusts, and that the child could recite an entire vocabulary list of dinosaurs when fingers were involved. Rodrigo bought a small set of colored pencils and left them in his office drawer. He had no real reason beyond wanting to have something on hand when a small visitor arrived, but having them there became significant, an invitation without pressure. Their first real test came from the small, ordinary kind that does not ask permission before it arrives. It began with a late-night message. "Beatrice, urgent. Client pulled in the pitch for tomorrow. Can you watch Lucas?" She kept it practical, the way she always did. No drama. She sent the neighborhood and the time and the bare facts. Rodrigo read it with a sudden visceral clarity. This was the moment that would reveal whether his Saturday and his soft new routine were habits or curiosities. He cleared his calendar without fanfare. He called an assistant and shifted a meeting. He postponed an email with the same methodical care he gave a blueprint. It did not feel like sacrifice. It felt like choosing a weight to carry. He arrived at their apartment with a pizza still warm in its box and a thermos of hot chocolate because he had remembered the bill of particulars from the park. Lucas liked his chocolate warm, and there was no shame in learning a small person's preferences. Beatrice left with a rush of gratitude and a practiced, anxious smile. The door closed. Rodrigo, who had navigated scaffolding plans and worried over elevations, found himself fumbling with a small plastic dinosaur that Lucas demanded be taken seriously. He read a book aloud in a voice he did not know he owned. He cut out shapes with scissors while Lucas insisted they were parts of a monster. The afternoon passed with scraped knees and a triumphal nap. When Beatrice returned, flushed and glad, she looked at the apartment the way a professional inspects a job done well. She let him know, without extravagance, that she could always ask him again. Her thanks was sparse. Her trust, however, was not. There were other kinds of tests. Insistence by clients came in waves. A developer in Dubai wanted a model instantly. A contractor called with a structural emergency at 1 in the morning. Old habits tugged. Sometimes Rodrigo answered. Sometimes he did not. The difference was that when he did answer now, he did so with explicit trade-offs. He began to tell people, including himself, that some calls are for tomorrow. He put a small, visible sign on his office door. No, not an admonition for others, but a reminder for himself. People before plans. It embarrassed him the first week, like having a poster telling you to wear a seatbelt. But the sign worked as an anchor. He declined meetings with more ease, politely and with appointed alternatives. He learned to make time in small increments that were reliable rather than lofty promises that never arrived. Meanwhile, his interplay with Beatrice grew in its own slow ways. They shared meals more often. Sometimes she cooked because she liked to. She made stew with cassava once, and refused to let him call it exotic. It was simply what my neighbors make. On other nights, he brought a takeout box that tasted of a restaurant he wanted her to like. They traded stories, her work annoyances, his endless efforts to preempt building leaks. They nudged at each other's boundaries. He learned, gently and slowly, that Beatrice kept some things private not out of reserve, but out of necessity. She had reasons to be selective with her heart and her time. She had, after all, navigated a world where every misstep could mean lost hours of paying work. Rodrigo respected that. He asked few questions and listened to the ones she chose to answer. Lucas, meanwhile, assumed Rodrigo's presence the way children assume the existence of the sun, sometimes taken for granted, sometimes noticed in a moment of sudden light. He curled up on Rodrigo's lap and wanted to know whether a building could have a slide inside it. He demanded epic retellings about rooftops that bent like waves. When he learned that Rodrigo had once declined a job to be at a school play, he gave him the kind of praise children give without cynicism. "You are my favorite architect." Those short declarations lodged in Rodrigo with a tenderness he had not expected. Relationships, as Rodrigo had observed in models and in spaces that had to withstand wind and weather, require supports. There were practical supports that they navigated, schedules, bills, a client who forgot payments. Rodrigo helped with small things he could manage. He introduced Beatrice to a contact who needed a logo redesign and was impressed when she completed the work with muscular efficiency. He watched Lucas at a dentist appointment and listened to the child's ridiculous worries about losing a tooth. He did not solve her financial instability. He never presented money as a cure. What he offered was time, presence, a network when appropriate, and a steady, concrete willingness to be there. The crisis that would reveal his true capacity came on a humid Wednesday, a week before the picnic he would later orchestrate with a clumsy kind of hope. It was a day that began with normality and closed with a fever. Beatrice had a presentation that could not be moved. It was for a company that would mean a month's worth of steady work if she won it. She had been preparing for days, designing mock-ups, rehearsing slides under pressure. Lucas, meanwhile, woke hot and clingy, small cheeks flushed, the sort of simmer that parents recognize as the start of something. Beatrice messaged Rodrigo early. "Lucas, not well. I can't reschedule. I'm not asking you to cancel anything, just need to know if you could." She stopped. The ellipsis was the language of a life that often had to be made of halting sentences. Rodrigo read the message at the office, among tracing paper and models and the constant hum of people who believed the world would not wait. For a breath, he felt the old reflex, the one that placed him at the center of urgency, where deadlines were the test of worth. He could, in the abstract, reschedule the presentation. He could, in the abstract, stay out of it. But the choice was clear. In a way, many ethical tests are not. Staying would reinforce patterns that had emptied his birthdays and filled rooms with echo. Going would, in practical, humbling terms, mean fewer hours at his desk. He closed his laptop. He told his assistant to lead the meeting. He texted Beatrice, "I'll come now. Bring the kid." He locked up sketches and grabbed a small backpack with a collection of things he had learned could help. Thermometer, a favorite dinosaur book, a spare blanket. It was an inventory of small readiness. When he arrived at the apartment, Beatrice looked like someone wielding courage like a tool. Her hair was pulled up, there were dark circles under her eyes. Lucas was feverish, sheets damp at the temple, the little body hot in a way that made Rodrigo move, as if a foreign current had taught him the proper steps. She gave him directions, with the precision of someone who had practiced triage on 1,000 small domestic emergencies. He measured the temperature. It confirmed the rise. They called the pediatrician together on speaker and followed instructions. Encourage fluids, cool compresses, track symptoms. The child was delirious for hours, alternating between sleep and fretful waking, where he said silly sentences that mashed dinosaur facts with the name of a cartoon. Rodrigo sat in the small living room and did things that felt oddly sacred. He made a sponge with cool water and a washcloth and laid it on Lucas's forehead with the practiced gentleness of someone learning to hold pain without trying to fix it. He read the dinosaur book until his voice went hoarse, counting aloud all the different beasts. When the child woke and flung an arm around his neck for a moment of lucidity, he felt a fierce protectiveness he had not known how to harness before. He sat vigilant, the way one watches a fire, noting the alterations in temperature and breathing, keeping Beatrice updated when she called from the subway station on her way to the pitch. At one point, as the fever spiked and the room smelled faintly of citrus and medicinal wipes, Rodrigo realized he was not thinking about his projects at all. The buildings he'd designed seemed momentarily distant. There was the immediate task. Keep the child comfortable, call if anything changed, keep watch. He did not leave until the pediatrician had prescribed a dose and a plan, and until Lucas drifted into a long sleep, arm thrown across a dinosaur with the moral certainty of a child's embrace. Beatrice returned at dusk, having given the presentation by calling in during a lull, having paced the corridor of her office with slides shimmering on a laptop screen. She had not known whether she had won the account, but she had presented with the professionalism that made clients call her back. When she walked in, she looked exhausted in a way that stripped both of them of performative niceties. She sat on the couch and wept for a moment, tears that were not of drama, but of pure fatigue, surrendering into relief. Then she looked at Rodrigo with a steadiness that was both gratitude and assessment. "You stayed," she said. "I stayed," he answered. That small exchange, banal on its face, resonated like an unspoken covenant. In staying, he had made a choice that simplified the complicated calculus of their lives. It was not a heroic epiphany with trumpets. It was a slow folding of practice into habit. She did not owe him anything. She did not owe him the softening that followed. But she gave him a look that was equal parts tired and tender. In the weeks that followed, that look settled into something like habit too. The picnic that marked a new, intentional step came less than a month after the restaurant night. It was not lavish. Rodrigo did not produce a grand, public spectacle. Instead, he worked with an earnest clumsiness that suited him. He planned for a Saturday in late spring, when the city was generous with sun and the park grass was still forgiving. He invited them, Beatrice and Lucas, with a handwritten note that he left at their door because he liked the smallness of a paper invitation. He wanted to show that he could do ordinary affection without ornament. He woke early, nervous in a way he rarely felt outside of competitions, and tender with naive hope. He baked a chocolate cake, following a recipe he had found online and altering amounts the way an architect might alter a plan, by feel and with the audacity of someone trying. The cake emerged imperfect, slightly cracked on top, uneven, smelling strongly of sugar and cocoa. He told himself the imperfections mattered because they were human. He wrapped it in parchment paper and carried it like contraband to the park. When they arrived, Beatrice smiled at the sight of him with a cake under his arm and a picnic blanket. Lucas sprinted toward him, then returned to check the cake's legitimacy like a small judge. The blanket was not a design by any means, but it was clean and steady. They sat under a tree with a soft breeze that smelled like damp grass and a far-off grill. Rodrigo set out mismatched plates he had borrowed from a friend and a thermos of coffee. He placed the cake in the center and vowed, silently, not to let the moment be bigger than the fragility of two people learning one another. The cake was crooked when sliced. Frosting clung to his fingers and melted in the sun. Lucas declared it perfectly wobbly and ate his piece with the kind of concentration a small boy gives to justice. Beatrice sliced herself a modest portion and offered him the first piece like a sovereign. There was, in the simple act, a currency of trust being spent and invested. Rodrigo spoke then, quietly. He had not written a speech. He had instead a handful of sentences he could stammer through and live with. "I keep thinking about the night at the restaurant," he began, "about how empty it felt. And then about that night and now, and I don't want to be someone who only notices the life around him when he's missing it. I want to be here. For Lucas, for you, if you'll let me." He did not ask for marriage or promises. He asked for permission to be part of their life. He asked for a presence that would involve challenges and compromises. Beatrice listened with a stillness that did not demand a quick answer. She asked, eventually, about what it would mean practically. Schedules, expectations, whether he expected gratitude to be performed like trophies. She asked if he was prepared for the days that were dull, and the nights when nothing would make sense, and for the hard conversations that would come with merging lives. She said all of this not in accusation, but with a dignity born of experience. Rodrigo answered honestly. He told her how he intended to change things: fewer after-hours calls, better communication when work demanded time, commitments to be present for school events, and on simple weeks to share a weekday dinner. He did not promise more than he could keep. He also admitted that he would make mistakes. Beatrice nodded. The fact that he could admit he would fail sometimes was itself a kind of promise. Humility often looks like reliability in slow motion. They spoke about money too, practically and calmly. Rodrigo said that he could help in practical ways when that made a difference, but he insisted the relationship would not be one of transactions. Beatrice agreed and underlined the same line. Assistance must come without erasing dignity. There were things she would no doubt do on her own. There were things she preferred to keep private. They negotiated the contours of help in quiet, adult terms. It was not a romantic climax. It was a set of terms for real life. Lucas, meanwhile, commandeered the conversation at intervals with a demand that Rodrigo teach him the best secret handshake and a request that the cake be rearranged so there would be more frosting at the edges. At one point, the boy declared that Rodrigo's cake tasted like grown-up sunshine, and everyone laughed. Laughter, in that afternoon, served as an honest seal. When the day ended, there was no flourish. There was only a slow, mutual leaning toward the possibility of permanence. Beatrice accepted his invitation to be part of their lives with the practical clause of caution, "Show up," and he promised to do so. It was not a fairy tale pledge. It was an arrangement stretched out over weeks and months, and subject to weather like the rest of life. It felt, for both of them, more like building than like conquest. The months that followed read like a montage in plain clothes. There were small rituals, after-dinner walks to the corner bodega, where Lucas insisted on choosing a comic, and Rodrigo learned the store clerk's name. Friday nights where they cooked together, Beatrice directing the rhythm with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who knows the kitchen like a drawing board. Mornings where Rodrigo would bring a fresh loaf of bread because he had found a bakery he thought she might like. The changes were not dramatic, but persistent. Slowly, the outline of a chosen family took shape. Rodrigo translated some of his professional boundaries into family practices. He set a clear rule: no client calls after 9. He learned to leave the office earlier on Tuesdays for Lucas's soccer practice. When emergencies demanded late nights, he negotiated them into the schedule and made good on his reparations with a weekday breakfast or a museum trip. He refused politely when clients asked for immediate fixes that would require him to be absent from an event he had already committed to. Sometimes he failed. He sometimes answered a call in the middle of a recital and missed a perfect moment. Apologies were frequent at first, then less so as his discipline around boundaries strengthened. Beatrice noticed these changes because the proof of intention is shown in repetition. Trust, after all, is built with small bricks. When Rodrigo showed up repeatedly, at the dentist, at field days, at nights when Lucas was unable to sleep, it created a scaffolding that invited vulnerability. She also never stopped doing the hard work she had always done. She worked, argued for her worth with clients, took on the projects that mattered to her. Their lives did not become a seamless blend, but a negotiated partnership. He offered moments of ease and privilege she could accept without shame. She retained her agency and her ability to decline. He learned the subtleties of respecting lines she had drawn. They weathered ordinary friction. There were arguments about house rules and curfews, and whether school permission slips needed extra doubles checked. There were resentments when schedules clashed and nights when Rodrigo, stretched thin, forgot to pick up a prescription. They talked about these things like architects fix windows that leak water, with impatience and the practical attention to detail they both shared. They did not resolve everything. They learned the slow art of return, of saying sorry, of making amends, of planning better next time. On a quiet autumn evening, months after the picnic, Rodrigo sat at the kitchen table watching Lucas fold paper airplanes and Beatrice prepare a simple sauce. The apartment they shared had, over time, acquired evidence of life: a drawing of a dinosaur taped to the fridge, a stack of mismatched mugs, and a small hand-stitched pillow Lucas had made at kindergarten. The space did not look like an architect's showroom. It looked like home. Rodrigo thought then how oddly his initial measures of success had been. He had imagined trophies and applause as the only valid metrics. He had been wrong. Success began to read like presence, as small as a toothbrush placed deliberately on the side of the sink and as significant as a promise kept. He had built a different kind of structure now, one that was movable and noisy and beloved. The final scene of that steady arc did not involve a triumphant public proclamation. There was no dramatic wedding, no billboard of the change. There was instead a quiet Saturday morning. Pancakes burned at the edges, Lucas with syrup on his chin, Beatrice laughing at the syrup moustache as she wiped it away with a thumb. Rodrigo sat with a cup of coffee too hot for enjoyment and felt an embodied contentment that was not the brittle public kind he'd known before. He watched them, the small pair who had, by happenstance and choice, altered the scale of his life, and felt the rightness of a soft permanence. He did at one point take Beatrice's hand. She looked at him as if assessing a small plan. He did not ask for anything beyond what had already been given, her presence, the daily choice they both made. He said simply, "Stay with me." Not in a perfect way, but stay. Her smile was guarded and then open. She squeezed his hand in agreement. Not promises made in sweeping arcs, but a continued mutual willingness to show up. Time, as it always does, continued to advance. There were new challenges, jobs that tested his new boundaries, clients who wanted more of him. Yet there was a new reflex to answer, with a stabilizing phrase, "I will not be able to tonight. Can we do tomorrow?" It was small. It was radical by the standards of his previous life. On nights when he thought back to that private dining room and the 20 empty chairs, the memory no longer had the same hollowness. He could recall the Barolo cooling in its bucket, and the cutlery gleaming, and also the unfairness of expecting others to always arrange themselves around him. He could see now the improbable grace of a woman who had walked into the room with a child and changed the trajectory of an evening and, eventually, a life. He thought often of the simple, decisive act of moving his place card across the table and offering them a meal. Smallness had become a form of courage. Years later, the apartment walls would still hold the faint smudges of living. There would be new challenges, teenage rebellions, elder care conversations, the small betrayals and recoveries that accompany any family. But the foundation laid by repeated choices endured. Rodrigo would occasionally catch himself measuring time by the number of times he'd been present for a school recital or the steady rhythm of a Wednesday dinner. The towers he had built still stood in the skyline, but they no longer contained the totality of what he valued. He had learned that architecture could be more than glass and concrete. It could be the daily, deliberate act of building a life around people who returned the effort. On an ordinary evening, not marked by any ceremony, sitting at a kitchen table with a plate of messy cake between them and Lucas asleep upstairs with a dinosaur tucked under his arm, Rodrigo felt, once again, a quiet that was not empty. This time it felt like belonging. He reached across the table and took Beatrice's hand because it felt right to close the day with contact, with the practical intimacy of a shared life. She squeezed back and smiled in a way that meant they both understood what had been gained and what would always need tending. If anyone asked him about that first birthday, the night no one showed up, he would tell the truth, mildly and without theatrical regret. He would say that the absence taught him something important, that success measured by applause is fragile, but success measured by presence is durable. He would tell them how a single mother and her son walked into a private dining room and without sermonizing or pretense changed the course of a life because of one small human choice. To accept hospitality, to eat macaroni at a stranger's table, to stay present when it mattered. And when the story ended, because every story of becoming is also a story of continuation, they would eat the last piece of imperfect cake, wash the plates together, and agree that the work of staying, of choosing, of being present for one another, was the only architecture that truly lasted. If this story touched you, or if there's someone who once showed up for you in a small, decisive way, share it in the comments. Tell us who stayed and how it changed you.